Fintan McCarry from the Roger Casement Committee in Murlock Bay. In April 1918, the Irish News reported on an anti-conscription march in North Antrim, where the Sinn Féin pipe band led the Orange Order, who led the Ancient Order of Hibernians. I was wondering if anyone on the panel had any similar examples of unity in such a divisive period, because it wasn't what I had expected to see written down.
The anti-conscription campaign across the island really is one that involves a lot of unity. I can't give you any specific examples now, but my sense is that really, people we would essentially describe as Republicans lead that with the Church, with the Catholic Church, but that the Irish Parliamentary Party feels obliged to take part in that kind of thing, and that's why you have the AOH getting involved. So I think that's actually the general tone of things.
I think one thing we have to bear in mind as well is the amount of labour disputes during the war, which would have brought people together. I don't know what the religious analysis is of various strikers, but various groups go on strike. We've already touched on women in textile industry, there are strikes in the shipyard, there are strikes in agricultural labourers go on strike. There's a range of engineering strikes. Even the men who are, I gather, who were building the huts at Ballykindler at one stage struck for better conditions. So there's a whole other bunch of stuff that's going on during this war that doesn't necessarily involve political affiliation in the green or orange sense.
And the whole conscription crisis, I think, is totally extraordinary. The fact that in January 1916, Englishmen, Scotsmen and Welshmen were conscripted and Irishmen were not, in effect was a modification of the Union. Irishmen were privileged, their British counterparts were not. Redmond and the Home Rule Party got their way there. And I've come across the claim, I can't remember who it was who first put it across, I've come across the claim that if conscription had been imposed on Ireland in January 1916, along with the rest of the United Kingdom, opposition to it would have been led by the Home Rule Party, thereby giving it enormous popularity, of the sort that it wasn't ever to reacquire. And it would have made the Easter rebels totally marginalised. As it was, when conscription was imposed in 1918, it came far too late. Imposed in theory, not in practice. It came far too late to save the Home Rule Party, and it was Sinn Féin and the Irish Volunteers who were the beneficiaries. But things, as always, could have turned out otherwise.
It just struck me as odd to see Sinn Féin and the Orange Order in the same platform, so I just thought I'd put that to the panel.
It's kind of more on Michael's point, and it's a bit more from there to here. Just on the point of the decline of the Protestant population in the south after the formation of the Free State, how far did the Free State government go to dealing with the issue? Was it kind of a turn the head away and look the other way type issue, or was there actual active participation in trying to stop it? Obviously there was Protestant participation in the Shannon, famously Yates, but how far was there any action taken to stop this kind of decline in the Protestant population, and did it subsequently affect the Boundary Commission talks in 1925?
From the very beginning, one might say even before the beginning, before the Free State came into existence, before the provisional government came into existence, Arthur Griffith, as the leader of the Irish delegation, promised Lloyd George and promised Irish Unionists whom he met, we will defend you, we will look after your interests, we will make sure that you are not marginalised insofar as we can. Subsequently, and you mentioned the Senate, Cosgrave appointed half of the first Senate as Protestants. There were always Protestant MPs, TDs, in the Free State and Republic. So at the government level, there was determination not to engage in any sort of discrimination, to bend over backwards, to ensure the loyalty. I mean, Cosgrave himself gave a very down-to-earth and perhaps unworthy reason, among others, for doing this. If the Protestants leave the country, an enormous amount of the wealth of the country will go with them, and we will become impoverished. It'll make our job getting the money to getting the finances, managing our budgets, all that more difficult. But that was only one aspect or one reason. There were other more worthy reasons. A genuine belief that we want now to build a society in which the past will be forgotten. And Cosgrave and his government was very, very successful in building together alliances with former Redmondites and former Unionists. Where they failed spectacularly, of course, was to have any sort of dealings with the Republicans. But at the top, there was a determination to stamp out this low-level sectarianism, which did, with one or two marginal exceptions, die out. And on the whole, after 1922-23, the Free State Republic's record was one that a southerner like myself can be proud of.
Just to come in on that point as well, Michael, I think we're in danger sometimes of attributing too much power to states and governments, and probably one of the main reasons for the decline of the southern Protestant population, particularly, and not just that large decline of 1/3 between 1911 and 1926, but onwards, from 1926 onwards, is nothing to do with government policy. It is to do with the laws governing mixed marriages and the Ne Temere decree, and the fact that most Protestants entering a mixed marriage were expected to raise their children as Catholics.
First of all, an observation. I did, Philip, go to a tour of the battlefields of Flanders, and it's a very moving experience. I went as a nationalist, not as a unionist, but it was a guided tour. And the guide was an ex-British Army man, and he's very knowledgeable. To my knowledge, the week prior to the Battle of the Somme, the bombardment allegedly fired about 1 million shells at the German emplacements. Now, at that point, 2 years into the war, a lot of men had been lost out of Britain working in munitions factories to be replaced by women. Now, no difficulty there, but in fact they were badly trained, and in fact a lot of the 1 million shells actually didn't explode. My question to the guide was, were there any field trials done, say, somewhere like Dartmoor, where you pile of guns, pile of barbed wire? This thing was never tried. These men were told to walk towards the enemy because there isn't going to be an enemy there, and the whole thing was they were just went to their slaughter. Now I'll come to my question. The leaders and the people who took part in 1916 saw themselves as successors of people who had generations gone before us, even in the proclamation, that in every generation Irish people had sort of risen up in armed conflict to rid themselves of the English yoke. They presumably thought it was a valid view that there's no moral authority for any form of English rule in Ireland. Was that a valid view, and is it still valid today?
Historian of Sinn Féin. See, I'm getting my own back on him now for all those years in UCD.
As far as Irish nationalists were concerned, and I'm speaking of two different communities and traditions and sets of loyalties in Ireland, as far as Irish nationalists were concerned, there was by and large, a repudiation of the validity of British rule. That had been masked, of course, over many decades by acquiescence in the fact that the British cannot be thrown out, we've got to accept the existing facts of life and so on. And Ireland was not a colony, of course, in the sense that India was, sending more than 100 MPs to Westminster. So it was complicated, but there was a deep down refusal to accept the legality of British rule, even on the part of many supporters of the Home Rule Party. That is the national side. On the unionist side, of course, there is full acceptance of the right of not English rule, to use your words, but of Ireland, or at least Ulster, remaining part of the United Kingdom. And this was ignored completely, of course, by the Easter rebels. Point I mentioned earlier, and I think others have mentioned it too. But the important thing is that one tradition, one community said no, the other said yes. To treat Ireland as an undifferentiated unit, as the Easter rebels did, is simplistic and distorting.
Just one other point I'd like to come in on that myself is, and it relates to the issue of equivalence between Germany and Britain. At no point did British rule in Ireland cease to do things like prevent the 1918 general election from going ahead. So essential parts of the British democratic tradition, I think, were essential in allowing the Irish Revolution to be as successful as it was.
I think the conference has really succeeded in taking these debates from the academy into the public square. It's great that that linkage is made. And of course it is in the public square because dealing with the past is one of the big issues in the talks at the minute. And so it's just an observation I would make that I note that the leaders of mainstream unionism, like Mike Nesbitt, if I can call him such, he has spoken recently very disparagingly about the 1916 Rising, and that struck me as interesting because I think it's inconceivable that leaders of mainstream nationalism would speak that way about the Somme. And I was just wondering if anyone had any comment on that.
I'll answer that just partly with a question, which is that Queen Elizabeth II has paid tribute to the leaders of the Rising, and if you are a member of a community which sees itself as her most loyal subjects, why would you not do the same? So it would be curious for Unionists, I think, to take that approach, given what their Queen has done. But you know, this of course, the way we view history. I don't know if Dominic was going to make this point, but one of the powerful cases that Dominic makes is that none of this remembrance is about history. This is all about community identity now. And Philip very compellingly showed why the Somme is so important. And I don't disagree with any of that. But if I tell you that from the Shankill, 12% of the Shankill's fatalities from the First World War were on the 1st and 2nd of July 1916. Now that's 12% on a couple of days, which is something like 0.01% of the days of the war. This is a huge spike in a graph of fatalities. There's no question it's the single biggest event. But if you're actually interested in the history, then why would you forget the other 88%? Why are only the 12% killed in the Ulster Division deemed worthy of memory? Why are the first UVF men killed on the Western Front in the retreat from Mons and in 1915 and at Gallipoli in 1915, why are they not remembered on murals? Why is there no Gallipoli mural in the Shankill? And this sort of raises some interesting questions about why certain things are privileged. And you can see this, final point, you can see this in Messines and the way in which that has been remembered as the 16th and 36th Divisions fighting side by side. I published about a year ago an article in the British Journal for Military History pointing out the very simple fact that if you have two divisions side by side, they have people on other sides. And at least half of the Ulster Division does not have the Irish Division on its flank. And indeed, the composition of those battalions within the two divisions, in some cases, is half English and Scottish. And so that's a myth that no one's challenged yet. I've tried to, but it's not really been picked up. It's a myth told for purposes of unity. And I think, you know, in the interest of good history, historians have a duty to try and tap away at those myths even when they have a positive aim.
Well, I think Gallipoli is harder to remember because it's a more complex story, and I'll tell you what, it's unravelling still on our screens today, this dismantling of the Ottoman Empire and what's going on in Syria. It's a much more uncomfortable, relevant story in global terms right now. But what I want to say is I think Nesbitt is wrong to speak the way he did. I think Jim Allister was wrong to speak the way he did about the Easter Rising. Number one, it's a globally important story. It's a significant moment in 20th century history, apart from anything in Ireland. And secondly, what I want to say is at the community level, that's not necessarily echoed at all. I recently took a group, and I know Richard and others may have done exactly the same. I took a group from Lurgan, which involved former loyalist combatants and their families, and Republican combatants and their families, and we went down to Dublin together, spent a weekend, made a small film about it, paid our respects, if you want to put it that way, to the people who died on all sides in that event. And that can happen amicably without a cross word said.
If I could make just a very, very general point about myths and memories. The Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm wrote some years ago, shortly before he died, people don't remember history. They are reminded of historical events. The question we should ask is, who is doing the reminding?
Nigel,